Thank you very much, Nicole. My name's Jackie. I'm the Education and Outreach Manager here at the BD. And my task for today is to explain to you why I think New Zealand flax is way cool. Now, you might wonder why someone from Vancouver is completely enamored with New Zealand flax. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself so you understand a little bit about why I'm so convinced that this is such an amazing plant. So my master's degree is in ethnobotany. That means when I went to school, I studied botany, but I also studied anthropology. And what I'm really most interested in is how people and plants come together. Wherever I have the opportunity to live, to work, to study, or visit, I like to talk to people about their plants. So I spent some time in Kent, and I learned about oast houses. Oast houses are built solely for one purpose, and that purpose is for drying hops. And hops is what makes beer taste so delicious. So I learned about oast houses when I was living in England. I talked to some marigold sellers when I was in Kathmandu. I spent some time in Nepal. I spent some time in South Africa where I learned about some traditional medicine, and this is a market in Soweto. Part of my master's thesis was interviewing people and talking about their vegetables. And this man here is showing us a prize-winning leek. He's actually showing you how to dress a leek. Now, you dress a leek for show. This is when you're going into competition. There is a certain way to display the roots and the leaves. And Mr. Coe, the man in this picture here, is an expert at dressing leeks. I also spent some time in the Middle East where they have all kinds of amazing vegetables and markets. So you can see wherever I go, I am very interested in people and their plants. So before I ended up at the BD Museum, I was living in New Zealand. I was the Education and Outreach Manager for the Auckland Botanical Gardens. And while I was in Auckland, I had the opportunity to meet these two amazing women. Carrie Gilbanks, she is the curator of the native plant collection at the Auckland Botanical Garden. And Annie Amu, she is a community leader and teacher. And both these women are very accomplished flax weavers. They taught me a great deal about flax. They showed me how to use it, how to respect it. They also explained to me how important it is. And so I really owe a lot to Carrie and to Annie. And I just want us to take a minute to think about them because they're here in the room with us today, really in spirit. We're standing in front of what's called the Pa Harakiki. So Pa Harakiki, those are two Maori words. Maori are the first people in New Zealand. Pa is like a plantation or a garden or a collection, and Harakiki is the Maori word for New Zealand flax. So Annie and Carrie and I are standing in front of the Pa Harakiki, or the New Zealand Flax collection at the Botanical Gardens. This is an amazing collection, and I'm going to show you a few more images of it a little later on. So I have 4 reasons why I believe that New Zealand flax is way cool. The first reason is its origin and location. The second reason is its amazing size and shape. My third reason is it plays a really interesting ecological role. And my fourth reason is the impact that it has on people. So we're going to look at my 4 points very closely, and then I'm sure by the time we're finished, you will all come to the same conclusion as me, that New Zealand flax is way cool. All right, my first point, the origin and location of New Zealand flax. Here's a beautiful picture of flax on the beach. The first cool point about New Zealand flax is that it comes from New Zealand. So here we are, the red star, northern hemisphere, and then you look all the way to the other side of the world where the second red star is. That's where New Zealand is. So I have a bit of a side note here, because I also think New Zealand is way cool. So a couple reasons why you think why New Zealand should be considered way cool. New Zealand has an amazingly high number of endemic species. And what endemic means is that it's unique to a certain location. You don't find it anywhere else. So New Zealand is full of these quirky endemic species, things that just don't exist anywhere else on the planet. And I have a few fast facts for people that are interested. A lot of the native plants, so these are not things that were introduced by people, but a lot of the naturally occurring plants in New Zealand, 80% of those are endemic. You only find them on those 2 little islands in the South Seas. 70% of their terrestrial and freshwater birds, and an amazing 90% of the freshwater fish are endemics. So things like this little adorable kiwi, that's an endemic. You don't find that anywhere else. So that's my side note on why I think New Zealand is way cool. Some people might ask, why does it have this really awkward or really weird kind of high numbers of endemics? There are a couple reasons. New Zealand has been on its own for a very long period of time. It was part of Gondwana, which was a collection of continents. So hundreds of millions of years ago, all the continents were together in something called Pangaea. Pangaea broke apart, and Gondwana was a portion of Pangaea. Then Gondwana went to break apart into other continents. So you can see in this image South Africa, Africa, Antarctica, and New Zealand down the bottom. They used to be all connected. Then New Zealand started to float away quite early on in that breakup of Gondwana. Another interesting fact about New Zealand is that people have only lived in New Zealand since about the 13th century. As you know, we have a big impact wherever we go on the environment. So imagine a place that didn't have people for such a very long time. Sort of adds to the interesting mix of flora and fauna that you find on those two islands. A few more cool facts about New Zealand. There are no terrestrial mammals except for bats, which is great when you go camping because you don't have to worry about bears or cougars or coyotes or anything big. There's also no snakes, which is fabulous. There are a whole bunch of their plants are called Gondwana plants, and Gondwana plants are really interesting. There's groups called podocarps and groups called southern beeches. Gondwana plants are things that are shared amongst Gondwana. So you find trees in New Zealand, you see relatives of those trees in South Africa and Chile. That's really strange. So people use that kind of thing as evidence for that Gondwana, for evidence that all those continents were at one point joined. There's also geological similarities in some places, as well as fossil records that hint that those places were all connected. But Gondwana plants are one of those interesting connections. Another interesting fact about New Zealand, most of the fauna is insects and birds, and many of them are flightless. That's very interesting, I think. I think it does tie in with the fact that there were no mammals creeping around as predators on some of those things. So two other very interesting species, and then we'll get back to the flax. There's only one poisonous animal on the whole island, and it's a little spider that lives on the beach. And if you actually get bitten by one, you're very lucky because they're incredibly rare. And the coolest thing next to the flax is a giant carnivorous land snails. I urge you, if you have time after this lecture, please go on YouTube and look for videos of these carnivorous snails in action. They eat earthworms and slugs, and it's incredible. They stalk their prey, and then they pounce and they suck it in. It's definitely quality internet time. I would highly recommend it. That's my little side note on why New Zealand is such an interesting place. But back to the flax, because we're here to talk about flax. So we established it's native to New Zealand, but even within New Zealand, the thing that makes flax amazing is it tolerates a range of conditions. You find it all the way from the tip of the North Island, all the way down to the south, all the way down to places like Stewart Island. And as you find it all the way across the country, you find it in a variety of locations. You find it on the sides of mountains, you find it in salt marshes, you find it in fields, in people's gardens, at the side of the road, and on beaches like we saw. This is amazing. There are very few plants anywhere in the world that you find in all those different conditions. And I did want to point out, because we're in the southern hemisphere, the northern part of the country is the warmest. So a place like Auckland, that's subtropical, very rarely gets to below 10 degrees, even in the wintertime. You find flax there. You also find flax in the sort of Queenstown and Mount Cook area. That's where they go skiing. So you find flax in this area as well. There's snow. It's a little bit colder in the wintertime. You even find flax in Stewart Island. Stewart Island's like a hop, skip, and a jump to Antarctica. It's that close to being at that extreme south. And you find flax all the way across the country. So I think that's a pretty amazing fact about flax. So there's my summary point. Comes from New Zealand, awesome things come from New Zealand. Second point, tolerates a wide range of conditions. I'm sure you're all convinced on the first point of why New Zealand flax is way cool. Second point, size and shape. First, we're going to talk size. The flower stalks of New Zealand flax can reach up to 5 meters. I am 1.5 meters tall. If you put another one of me on top, that's just 3. You'd have to put another one, and then you'd have to put my legs on top. That gives you an idea of how big the flower is on New Zealand flax. And you'll also take a look at the structure of flax. So what you'll see is there are these little side branches across that big, tall flower spike. Each one of those little side branches or trusses holds a whole bunch of flowers. probably about 20 flowers in each little side branch. If you add those up over 5 meters, that is hundreds of flowers on one flower stalk. The flower stalks are also very interesting. When they first come up, they're really sappy. They're full of lots of sap, and they're very, very heavy. However, as they age and as the flowers die back, they become incredibly light, and they actually become very buoyant. They'll float in water. So if you needed a raft or you needed to make something that would float, you could harvest these amazing flower stalks. So you have a very big piece of material to work with that floats in water. And that's a pretty amazing thing. I just wanted to show you some of the progression so you got to see a little bit about how the flower turns into the seeds. So on the left is a picture, everything from flower bud, and then it opens up and you can see what's extending out. That's where the pollen is made. Those are called the stamens. I'll see if this is on. Maybe not. There we go. So right there, that's where the pollen's made. And then you can see that it's been pollinated. Now it's turning into a seed pod. And then the seed pod, it stays on those giant flower stalks, and it gets dry. It gets really dry, it gets brittle, and it bursts open. And inside are thousands of little black papery seeds. They're really light, and they're easily distributed by the wind. So you can see hundreds of flowers making thousands of seeds. So that's another reason why I think New Zealand flax is way cool. The other sort of size and shape point is the size of the leaves. So there I am on my balcony, and I've collected some leaves that I'm going to use to make some baskets. And you can see that those leaves are clearly taller than I am. And that is not one of the biggest plants. That's just to give you a sample of rough size of the foliage or of the leaves. And what else is really interesting is these leaves are extremely tough. They're very fibrous. They've got long cords running through them, long strands of fiber. We're going to talk about those in more detail. But even from those images, you can see the stripes. You can see how sturdy and how tough those leaves are. Here I have a picture, and that's a cross-section of a leaf. So you're looking at the side of the leaf, and you're looking inside. And I know you can't read the text, but what the text is telling you is these red parts here are the fibers, or strands of fiber. And you can see it goes all the way from the top of the leaf to the bottom of the leaf. So there's strands of fiber going all the way through. These little parts here, these are the green parts. Those are the photosynthetic parts that are helping convert sunlight into sugars and feed the plant. But what you really need to get out of that image is these amazing strands of fiber that you can see even under our microscope. And these strands are these strands here that you see. And that's going to give you a hint at why people think New Zealand flax is so cool and so useful, because that kind of really tough fiber is very useful for people. So now that you've seen these fibers here, can you see these stripes in here? These are the strong fibers running through the leaves. This makes the plant very sturdy and often makes the leaves stand straight up and down. Even when they get pelted with rain and things, they're quite strong and quite sturdy. So a few fast flax. I wanted to see if I could say it or not. So I've used a couple different names for this plant. And what I wanted to clear up was that flax has a scientific name. Its name is Phormium tenax. Scientific names are often derived from Latin or Greek. And what we'll see here is the phormium part, that's the genus part. Phormium is Greek for mat. Now that gives you a clue as to how this plant has been used in the past. And tenax is Latin for strong. So as soon as you read that scientific name, you know that this is a very strong, robust plant, and you know that it's a very useful plant. So its name itself is telling you something about the qualities of the plant. And you'll notice we're talking about some different common names for this plant as well. We started talking about it as New Zealand flax. Then I introduced to you to the Maori term for this, harakiki. But what about flax? Some of you might know a different kind of flax. Some of you might be familiar with this type of flax. If you have a nice linen shirt that you wear when it's really hot outside, it comes from this plant here. It comes from flax. This flax is from Europe. And how New Zealand flax got its name, New Zealand flax, is when the Europeans arrived in New Zealand. They saw people using a fiber, and the only thing that this reminded them of was flax. That's all they had. That was their previous understanding, was we used our flax for this type of fiber. They saw this fiber. That's how New Zealand flax got its name. So this is why we like Latin names, because you see there's no confusion. Latin names, you know what you're talking about. Common names sometimes get a little bit confusing because we bring with us what we know from our home. And so we often say, that reminds me of this. But then when I'm talking to someone else, they don't have the same background. They may not be talking about the same thing. So I hope that clears up a little bit about names. I like to call New Zealand flax Harakiki, but I'll go in between those two terms. But now you know what I'm talking about when I use those two terms. So we were talking about size and shape. We talked about the flowers and we talked about the leaves. Now I want to talk about the shape of the plant itself. So you see this cluster of Harakiki on the beach. And what this is it's actually made up of a series of leaves that are produced in fans. If you hold your hand up, this is almost like the leaf structure. So when we see that clump, we've got a hand here, we've got a hand in behind it, we've got another hand here. So all the leaves are coming out of these fan clusters. This fan shape is very typical, it's very iconic of how New Zealand flax grows. What's interesting is this fan shape. When the Maori people are talking about flax and when they're looking at flax, the fan shape, they use something called, they use an analogy to talk about it, and they call it the flax whānau. Whānau means family. So when you look at this hand shape, they use the analogy of the family to talk about the fan shape. In the center, this is the newest leaf. This is the youngest leaf. This is the baby. This is the growing point. On either sides of the baby are the mother and the father. On the sides of mother and father are the ancestors. So when you're talking about New Zealand flax, you can use that family analogy. It's very interesting because that middle part here, that is the growing point. That is where all the new life begins, where the baby is. These outer leaves, they get a bit older, they fall away. So the ancestors have their role and then they pass on. And you remember those ancestors? But you also remember when you're harvesting flax that you never want to separate the family. You never want to take away the mother and the baby and the father because the family will die out. So I'll talk about that in the next slide. But I want you to think, when you see this word whānau, it means family. So it's used to describe the growth habit or the structure of New Zealand flax. So we learned about the Harakiki whānau, or the family. The next word I want to teach you is tihanga. Tihanga is protocol. And this talks about the shape of the flax, but it also talks about how you approach flax. So when you're harvesting, you have to follow a certain protocol, and that's what we just talked about. We talked about that protocol of never breaking up the family. So you can see if you wanted to harvest some flax to use it and you were following a traditional tihanga or a traditional protocol for harvesting, you would start with it here. You would identify your baby, you would identify your mother and your father, and then you would identify the ancestors. And that's where you would cut. So you can see in this image, the ancestors are being removed for use, but the growing point, the center point, where the new life and the new leaves are emerging, that's left intact. So you can see there's the baby, there's the mother and the father, and the ancestors have been removed. So that fan shape of flax, I think, is really very interesting. And the family analogy, talking about that fan shape, I think is another reason that why New Zealand flax is so cool. So my summary points for point 2, we talked about its size. We talked about those giant flower stalks that would reach the ceiling if it was here inside this building. We talked about the hundreds of flowers and the possible thousands of seeds that one flower stalk can produce. And then we talked about the leaves, and we talked about how they're produced in those fan shapes. And we talked about that family analogy when we're looking at that fan shape and we're thinking about how we could sustainably harvest from that fan shape. I also think that Harakiki, or New Zealand flax, is so amazing because it plays an ecological role. It's a very important plant to a lot of other organisms in New Zealand. So here's 2 examples. These are very beautiful. They look like moths, but they're not. They're plant hoppers. I don't know the proper Latin term, but there's someone in the audience that would probably tell us more about that. These plant hoppers are beautiful. They have translucent wings, so you can see through them. They're almost like stained glass. They have a sucking mouth part, so that they feed on the sap of Harakiki. So when you walk past one of these giant flax bushes, you get a little cloud of these beautiful stained glass leaf hoppers coming out. Another thing that depends on Harakiki is the flax weevil. I cannot imagine what its mouth parts are like, because this is an extremely fibrous, extremely sturdy leaf, and it looks like it's munched a fairly big hole in that. So the flax weevil and the passion fruit hoppers are two things that depend on flax. I have a few more. So New Zealand is home to crazy things called giant wettas. This is a man's hand holding this humongous insect. This is a particularly large one that I chose for demonstration purposes. I did not see the one this big. I did see ones as big as my hand. So wettas are a kind of insect that live in New Zealand, and they depend on flax. To get this big, you have to molt. You have to lose your exoskeleton, get a little bit bigger, and have a new one. So there's a series of shedding your skin and becoming larger. And a lot of wettas use Harakiki as their sheltered, safe place in order to carry out this molting. Because this is a safe place. When you first emerge like this, I imagine you're quite tender and quite vulnerable. So you need a big flax bush that's going to keep you protected from some of your predators. Let's just have one more look at how big that is. So we talked about having a safe place to molt, but of course, your enemies are going to figure that out pretty soon. And this gecko feeds on wettas, and this gecko actually lives in the flax bushes as well. So the gecko has figured out that the big juicy wettas also like flax bushes. And so both of these can be found living amongst the flax. This is an interesting fact. I read that wettas eat their own exoskeleton after they emerge in order to reuse the chitin that was in their exoskeleton. So that is recycling at work. So it's not just insects that depend on Harakiki or New Zealand flax. These birds are amazing. They have a beautiful call. They're called tuis. Europeans call them parson birds because of that white fluff reminded them of some religious figures. But most Kiwis that I met call them tuis. And tuis like the nectar that's inside. You see this flower? It's quite tube-shaped, and at the very bottom of that tube-shaped flower is a little pool of nectar. So that's what that tui is going for. He can get his beak just far enough down to lap up some of that nectar. But something interesting happens when that tui goes in to get the nectar. And I want you to have a close look at his head there, because he's covered in pollen. And so you see here, he's brushed up against these. These are the stamens. Those are the pollen-producing parts of the flower. So that tui has brushed up against those stamens, and now he's got pollen smack in the middle of his head. And what he's going to do is he's going to go to another flower, and he's going to take that pollen with him. And so tuis are carrying out this pollination role. Tuis are helping flax make seeds. This is another bird that does a very similar thing. It's called the bellbird. The story goes when Captain Cook, he was one of the first Europeans to arrive in New Zealand, he heard this bird singing, and he thought it sounded like a series of exquisite bells, just very clear, very beautiful sound. That's how it got its English name of bellbird. There's also a very famous sort of saying or familiar quote that people like to bring out, and it talks about the relationship between the bellbird and the Harakiki. And it says, if the heart of the Harakiki was removed, where would the bellbird sing? So this says a lot about sustainable harvest. This says a lot about interactions in nature. It says a lot about the role that these two organisms play in people's lives and the way they understand their country and their nature around them, and the importance of this sort of taking care of these interesting and these unique species. So this is the bellbird, which also feeds on some of that nectar and does some of that pollinating, just like the tui does. And this is one more interesting ecological role that Harakiki can play. So it provides shelter for yellow-eyed penguins. Yellow-eyed penguins are highly endangered. You find them in the South Island of New Zealand. And they like to waddle down these rocky shores into the water. They spend some time out in the water, then they waddle back up, and they actually go across the beach into sort of the more vegetative areas at the edges, and they plunk down underneath Harakiki. And this is where it's sheltered, it's safe, you're away from the sea breezes, you're away from a lot of predators. Right here, you're really exposed. This is open seashore, whereas here you can tuck in and you can have a safe place to nest and a safe place to sleep in between fishing expeditions. So I tried this out myself. So this is a campsite on the South Island, just really close to where those yellow penguins are. They actually had some at our campsite as well. And this was the view from my tent. It was amazing, but it was also really cold at night. It was incredibly windy and blustery, and you got sea foam in your face. But we snuggled up inside some of that flax, and that's all flax all around. And it was warm, and it was quiet, and you really did feel like this was a very safe and very sheltered spot. So I put it to the test, and I agree with the penguins. I think that Harakiki provides a really nice, safe, sheltered spot for people to sleep. So my summary for the important ecological role that New Zealand Flax plays is it provides food and shelter to a variety of living things, penguins and myself included. It is so important that really when you are in New Zealand, when anyone is about to start a restoration project, when they're going to try and reclaim a piece of beachfront or mountain side, they start by planting flax. It's the first thing to go in. It will attract a lot of the other native species. It will stabilize the ground. It's big. It's providing shelter. Flax is the first place that a lot of restoration projects start with because it plays that really key ecological role. These people are trying to rebuild some penguin habitat on the South Island. So the first thing they're doing is planting flax to give those penguins a place to sleep. And my fourth point, why New Zealand flax is way cool and so important, is because it's had a profound impact on people. I mentioned in one of my first slides, the very first people to arrive in New Zealand came at about the 13th century. And when these people arrived, so just like any of us, when we go on a big trip, what do we bring with us? We bring our previous knowledge, the things we learned at school, the things our parents taught us, and we bring some things from home that we think are going to be important. And one of the things that people brought when they set out on a big adventure is they brought this plant. They brought parts, probably seeds, maybe some cuttings of this plant here. This is paper mulberry. Polynesians were very skilled at making lots of different fabrics out of paper mulberry. I have an example at the front here. And when we're done, you're more welcome to come and touch it and to really feel it and see what it looks like. So they brought paper mulberry with them, and they brought their experience and their knowledge of weaving and of making textiles. There was one big problem when they got to New Zealand. It was significantly colder than anywhere else they'd ever lived before. And their paper mulberry did not grow. So what do we do? What do we do when we get somewhere and what we had planned doesn't quite work? So we start looking around, we start looking for options. And Harakiki, or New Zealand flax, was a vital discovery. It provided the basic material so you can meet your basic needs. Using Harakiki, you can start gathering some food, you can get some shelter, you can get some clothing, and you can start living in this new environment when you realize that your paper mulberry bush is not going to make it through the winter and you have an entire community of people that you need to feed and keep warm and keep safe. So using previous knowledge, using the skill of how to use and manipulate natural fibers, the first settlers in New Zealand were able to take that skill and apply it to a new plant, a plant that is ubiquitous, a plant that we find everywhere. They would have seen loads of this plant and would have been able to transfer some of that previous knowledge and skill and survive in this new place. So you can use your weaving skills to make things called kitties and to make fariki, which are the mats. That's my hand too. So there's two different types of ways of approaching weaving with flax. There was the fariki and the kiti, which we saw, which is the leaves themselves, and that's things like this, which again, you're welcome to come up and touch at the end. Over time, people learned how to extract just the fiber from the leaf. So we saw that fiber underneath on the magnification on that image. We saw those big, long cords of fiber. People became more sophisticated and were able to really extract this muka, is what they call it, or the fiber, and to use that in different ways. So again, using previous knowledge about how to use natural material to make textiles, and then applying it to this new fiber, this fiber that they were discovering in Harakiki. And because of the conditions, because it was so cold, there was an increasing need for cloaks. And so there became this a repertoire of different cloaks for different occasions. And there's many different styles of cloaks, all based on harakiki. This woman here, she's wearing what we call a kurawai. And a kurawai is made entirely out of flax. And you see the black tassel parts. Those are also little fibers of flax that she's dyed in mud to make black. But the whole thing that she's wearing and the whole thing that she's making, this is all made out of flax. So this is a series of images. So I mentioned my two friends from New Zealand, Carrie and Annie, and they were the ones that told me a lot about flax. So one day I asked Carrie if she could show me just how do you take the muka, or you extract the fiber, out of flax leaves. So this is Carrie. She's going to show us how you get from this green leaf to some of that really fine fiber. So she starts with her leaf. She's removing the edges. The edges tend to be a little bit weak, and so whenever any weaver starts, I've watched them, they always remove the side edges because they're often a little bit damaged or frayed, so you really want to use the center part of the leaf. That's what she's trying to do, and she's dividing it up into manageable sections. So she's got it into sections, and the next thing she's going to do is she takes a really dull knife, she makes a little cut, but you notice she doesn't cut all the way through. So she's just trying to break the upper surface of the leaf. The bottom part of this leaf is still attached. So we're just making a little bit of a notch in the leaf. We're not cutting it in half. And then she takes a green mussel, a green-lipped mussel shell. This green-lipped mussel is the perfect tool for extracting muka from harakiki. This is the tool of choice. This is what master weavers will use. You can use a butter knife, but most people prefer to find their own green-lipped mussel shell. You need something with a very stiff but also a very straight surface. And she's going to run this along the surface of the flax leaf. So you can see as she's running it across, the leaf is starting to separate into two pieces. So she's pulling and she's running the mussel shell across the leaf, and it's starting to separate out. And this is the green part, this is the photosynthetic part of the plant, and this part here is the fiber. And now she's made her way almost all the way down her piece of leaf. And here she's showing you the two sides. She's pulled away the photosynthetic part, and she's showing you how she can just extract just the fibers on their own with a little bit of green. Then she's going to go back over it with her mussel shell to just comb out some of the remaining leaf parts. And as she's doing that, she's working into a bin, and you can see it's just becoming increasingly just the fiber is left. So she's showing you the fiber that she's taken. And I have a sample here at the front that you guys can touch after. So you can see, so this is when it's not spun. This is just the raw fiber. This actually gets really messy. As you can see at the front table, I've got a little bit here that's all crumpled up. So what you need to do, and we do the same thing with cotton, we do the same thing with wool, is you need to card it or you need to make it smooth and straight so that people can use it for weaving. So that's her next step. So what you do is you roll it up and down your leg. So you take this strand and you start to roll it. So this is all the fiber from one leaf. You're going to roll that up and down your leg. And she's going back and forth. Because then what you end up with is a very organized bundle of fiber. If you didn't organize it like that, it would be really a pain in the butt to come back and try and weave with it later. So this is helping to organize it and to have one discrete bundle of fibers. And then you're going to go to your next leaf part, and you're going to do it again. I thought this was kind of a neat picture. Some people want to know what's happening at sort of a microscopic level, or what's actually happening when you, so there's the green-lit mussel shell, and this is what we saw Carrie doing. So there's that fiber strand going through from the top to the bottom of the flax leaf. And when Carrie runs her mussel shell down the surface, what she's doing is she's separating that little bit, that fiber, from the rest of the leaf. So this is the green part, this is the photosynthetic part. And there is a little bit of fiber, but what she's pulling out is just fiber. It's a pretty incredible process. And this is the result of what that fiber can do. This is a very high, this is a prestigious cloak. This cloak, people guess it took about 2 years. Someone spent 2 years of their lives making this cloak. This is the kind of cloak that a chief would have. This is a very high profile, high status cloak. But if you look at you can just imagine how smooth and how warm that would feel. It's amazing. What people found when we started, so people started using harakiki, becoming very sophisticated in the way we're using harakiki. We're extracting these fibers, we're using the foliage for different things. And like everything in nature, there's a certain amount of natural variety. One flax bush is a little bit different from another flax bush. And with close observation and using the plants so much, people began to select the plants for certain qualities. That one over there, that one's really, really strong. So if you need something that needs to take a lot of weight, these are the leaves I've been using. Some other ones are color. If you come up to the front after, you'll see that they dry to different colors. So if you're going for a particular effect or you want to make something special, you might start thinking about the color that the leaf turns when you're making something. Another thing is the quality of that muka. So what Carrie was showing you was some beautiful long strands of fiber. But having tried that process with a number of different things, not everything comes out that beautiful. Some flax plants, the fiber breaks or the fiber's not as strong or it doesn't pull away as nicely. So there are certain varieties of New Zealand flax that are much better for extracting muka than for using the leaves for weaving. So people started to recognize these differences and they started to name these plants. They also started to divide these plants and share them with their families. So these ladies here are dividing a flax plant. So we saw how big those plants were to start out with. And so it's quite a task to dig up a little chunk of that plant. So you can dig it up and you make sure you got some roots on there. And then what you can do is you can plant those two in two different places and both plants will grow. The feature is that both of these plants are exactly the same. So they came from the same flax bush. So they're clones. They're genetically identical. And that's what you want. If you find a characteristic that you want to keep going, you need to clone it. You can't leave it up to seeds. So seeds are a genetic recombination. So just like I am a genetic recombination of my parents, I am a little bit of my mom and a little bit of my dad, but I am a unique thing. If you wanted a certain feature and you wanted to make sure that it kept going, you would need to clone it or you would need to divide it. If we left it up to seeds, the seeds that came out of this plant might have some features of one parent, some features of another parent. So there's no guarantee. So if you find a really good plant that makes really good muka and you want to keep it and you want to pass it on to your grandkids or you want to share it with your aunt, you're going to divide it. You're going to take a piece of it because that guarantees that it still has those qualities. So that brings us back to the Auckland Botanical Gardens where I explained where I was working before I arrived at the Beatty. And our collection, our Pa Harakiki, was actually made up of 40 different named weaving varieties. So have a look. Can you tell the difference? Do you see 40 different types of weaving flax in there? I have to admit, I was a little suspicious when I first arrived. But then I started walking through the collection with Annie and with Carrie, and they started to show me what to look for. So I want you to keep that in mind. And think about it. There's 40 different types in there. And now I'll show you what you need to be looking for. This is what people were looking for. And you're looking at the edges of the plants. So you're looking at the tips, and you're looking at the colors on the side. So these tips, this one has this little hook. This one has a really strong tip. These two are given different names. They're naturally occurring varieties. They've been cultivated over centuries. They've been passed on between families. They stay a named variety over the centuries. Some of the weavers told me that the black tip and the black edged ones produce a better muka than the red tipped ones. But then there are some that will show you a special kind of red tip flax that has the best muka. So I think there's some local differences, but what's interesting is these name varieties are recognized, and these name varieties, their qualities are talked about, and this information is transmitted between groups. And so weavers know about these plants and about their quality. So one of the things that I was able to do in Auckland was to open up our collection to groups of weavers. And when someone was coming in and they know that their grandmother had woven with arahu, we were able to provide them with arahu. And I think that's a really important connection, because one of our problems with our beautiful flax collection is people weren't really engaged with it. People didn't really know what this was. And so we had a big campaign to try and get people to understand what this was, and to the people that did know, to welcome them in and to let them take part in this and to just get it back out in the community. Also, what happened over time was a lot of these weaving cultivars were lost. as different community groups were broken up, and as times changed, things were lost. And so our collection is one of the few collections that has this high number of these named weaving varieties. The information is still there. There are still people that remember hearing about these plants, and we have a place for them. So we were talking about the impact that flax had on people. So this is another profound impact of flax on people. There was quite a booming flax fiber industry. So when Europeans arrived, probably around the 1700s, again, really struck by the way that people were using flax. And this process became mechanized in the late 1860s. And the British especially started flax mills, and they processed the fiber. So there they're harvesting. This is the fiber that has been washed and is hanging out to dry. And you can see it just goes on forever. There's the flax mill in the background spewing out some smoke. And then this was all bundled up, put on a ship, and shipped off to England, where they made ropes and different kind of cordage out of flax fiber. You can see that these gentlemen here are probably not following the flax FANU protocol and are probably not leaving the baby and the mother and the father retained. And so this really cleared out a lot of natural flax kind of outcrops or traditional plantations were harvested to support this really booming industry. Flax towns sprung up, just like we have abandoned gold mining or abandoned mining towns. There are old towns that used to be booming because of the flax trade and then completely closed down once the bottom fell out of the flax market. So it ended probably around the Depression. There was a little bit of an increase during the Second World War when parts of Europe were being taken over, and the British and the Americans were worried about where flax was going to come, so flax being the linen, and they started looking south. They started looking to their colonies to provide materials for cordage. So there was a brief resurgence during the Second World War of using New Zealand flax to provide for, cordage material, but really this whole industry died out around the 1930s. But it's amazing how much fiber was able to be extracted. So since the 1950s, there's been a resurgence in weaving. This is a very famous woman, an amazing woman. If you have time after you've watched the YouTube video about the carnivorous land snails, please look up Digorous Tekanawa. She's an amazing lady. She's really responsible for bringing back and reviving Maori weaving. She was born into a family of very accomplished weavers, but she worked really hard to make weaving accessible to everyone and to really highlight the importance and the value of weaving. There's lots of contemporary shows and contemporary study and work on weaving. Both Carrie and Annie, my two friends from New Zealand, are completing fine arts degrees based entirely on weaving. So it's becoming something that's much more important than it had been, so probably before 1950s. Another thing that harakiki is having an impact on people because it's being incorporated into the curriculum. So one of my jobs when I was in New Zealand was I was teaching a lot of school programs at the Botanical Garden. Harakiki was used to teach almost any subject. It's integrated into the school curriculum. You use it to teach all different kinds of subjects. And these two kids here are learning how to identify those tips and those edges and to tell some of those weaving varieties apart. So New Zealand flax is kind of coming back into its own, and it's really, people are starting to recognize it and recognize it's important. It's a very iconic plant. It's something that everyone from New Zealand can identify, even if they know nothing about plants. And they've probably had some sort of experience with New Zealand flax. So it's really easy to say that New Zealand flax has had a profound impact on people in New Zealand. We talked about the actual fiber and the cordage, but harakiki can also be used medicinally. Obviously, it can be used to bandage things up or to make strong splints. It's very durable and it's very large. But also, there's a gel that comes out of the base when you cut harakiki, and it's almost like aloe vera. When you cut a piece of aloe vera and you get that quite squishy exudate, that's been used externally for a very long time, applied just like aloe vera to any kind of skin condition or any kind of cut. But I will have a little word of warning. It's an extremely strong purgative. If you put it on your hands and then you touch your face, it will clear you out. So that's also one of its medical benefits, is whatever is in you will be immediately released. It's quite amazing. So, so especially women, and there's a lot of men that have started flax weaving as well, you have to remember to wash your hands after doing your work before you eat, or else you will remember why. But anything that has such a strong reaction on the human body obviously has a lot of medical potential, and that's quite an amazing thing. And especially if you have ingested something terribly poisonous that you need to get rid of immediately, that is a very helpful thing to have. So there's a lot of interest in the medicinal properties of harakiki. I found this on a South Korean K-pop website. They were advertising this skin cream that's made out of the gel of harakiki. So it's being used a lot in the cosmetics industry as well as in some of the medicinals. And ornamental value. Every single one of you could go down to Canadian Tire or Walmart after this, and you could probably buy your very own flax plant. So flax has been transported around the world. It's been bred and it's been manipulated, so you get all these different colors, but we find it now everywhere. It's in almost all of our garden centers. This is a beautiful garden on Vancouver Island where they've used some flax as a very nice framing for this beautiful fountain. So it's just like it is ubiquitous or found everywhere in New Zealand, we're starting to see it everywhere here. I bet you will see these in the garden center next time you go. So you too could have your very own flax bush. I will tell you though that those colored varieties, these ones that are red and yellow, they don't manipulate as well. So the plain green ones, although they're maybe not as flashy, are actually a little bit more robust. There's something about these ones that make it a little bit weaker. You can still weave with them, but it's just not as strong as the traditional ones. So is there any more I can say about the impact that harakiki has had on people? It influenced people in the past. It's the whole reason why people were able to stay in New Zealand. It was a vital discovery for a group of people. It's been used now. It's in the present. People are learning how to weave. People are using it for restoration plantings. And it will be very valuable in the future. There's a lot of people that are looking into the qualities of these fibers and some of those medicinal properties as well. So harakiki has had a profound impact, not only on people in New Zealand, but people around the world. And now my grand finale. I believe I have met all 4 points. I told you that it is from New Zealand, which is home to things all awesome. I told you that it can live in all those different conditions in New Zealand, from the beaches to the mountains to the side of the road. I told you about its amazing shape. Remember those huge flower stalks and those big leaves that were taller than me? I told you about our ecological role. I showed you all the little insects, all the beautiful birds, and the little penguins that all survive and depend on this harakiki. I also showed you those giant wettas. So remember that. They all depend on this flax bush. And then I told you about the impact on people, because I think it's quite significant and it's quite enduring, and it's also global. Harakiki has an impact on your life as well as the people that live in New Zealand. And these are some resources if you would like to know more. And this is my last slide. So I'm going to say thank you very much. I hope you're convinced that New Zealand flax is way cool.